So, I watched Oldboy, the highly regarded, critically acclaimed cult classic that's loved by many and respected even by those who don't. Across the board, there seemed to be a consensus among its audience, praising the movie's creative direction, incredible cinematography, and phenomenal acting, which sounded exactly like the kind of gateway movie I needed to see in order to begin a cinematic awakening, so to speak. I was at a stage in my life where I was curious to venture out beyond my comfort zone, and the internet had no shortages of lists for me to pick through. It didn't take very long for me to recognize their pattern. Oldboy found itself on most recommendations, and I was sold pretty much immediately. So, enthusiastically, I watched it. And didn't get it. I failed to see what all the fuss was about, and couldn't really differentiate it from any other blockbuster I've already seen, besides from its crazy ending maybe. And while I understood that tastes could differ and things can be polarizing, the disconnect between what I read and what I saw just felt way too big. Come to find out that the one I watched was actually a remake, with the original being based in South Korea, nestled in the middle of the Vengeance trilogy directed by Park Chan-wook. This notion gave me a sense of relief, as I was ready to cautiously dive back in for the experience I was originally promised. And wow. The original was just that, original. Although being an adaptation itself, the movie takes quite a few artistic liberties very early on, deviating heavily from the source material and thereby quickly establishing its own identity, which is just pure style. Bold in its creativity and unique in its delivery, the end result of the 2003 version is an absolute delight for the senses. And unfortunately, I think that this is the main area where the 2013 version just falls short. Dynamic action shots are either replaced with bland, mundane imitations, that's if they aren't just omitted altogether, or pay homage to its predecessor in blatant and pretty uninteresting ways. And that's a shame, because it strips away everything that made the original special, and what's left is a very average retelling of a story that didn't really need that kind of treatment. Hence the pretty awful reception. Everyone was left wondering why there's an attempt to fix something that isn't broken, especially when the toolbox you're working with is rather questionable. Going over every single transgression of the remake could take forever, so I'll try to narrow my criticisms down, starting with a particular scene and seeing where the flow takes us from there. When Odesu is freed from his imprisonment, he is symbolically reborn. As his eyes slowly adjust to the long-forgotten sensation of sunlight, they land on a man sitting on the building's ledge, contemplating suicide. Odesu stalls him, but only long enough to fulfill a selfish need to really savor in his first human interaction in 15 long years. He sort of takes advantage of this man by using him as an outlet for all of his senses, including the retelling of his story until now, but afterwards couldn't be bothered to listen to the depressed man's problems because
웃어라. 온 세상이 너와 함께 웃을 것이다. 울어라. 너 혼자만 울게 될 것이다.
Not only does this moment symbolize a powerful dichotomy between the beginning of a life filled with opportunities and the hopelessness of an ending one, but it establishes our protagonist as an unsympathetic character whose first act of freedom could have been an attempt to prevent someone from taking their own life, but chose not to, painting a powerful portrait of what life in solitude has turned him into. It'll also serve as a parallel to the flashback scene at the end of the movie, and a man's last words will be echoed in the last sentence of Odessu's letter.
내가요. 아무리 짐승만도 못한 놈이어도요. 살 권리 있는 거 아닌가요?
This scene is completely left out of the remake, and the way we see Joe employ his senses is by eagerly embracing his few surroundings relatively briefly. To be fair, what we learn about the character in the original has already been well established in the remake at this point, but in the form of a much more unnecessarily drawn-out cliché. Joe drinks on the job, is unprofessional towards his coworkers, yells at his ex-wife, is late for child support, doesn't care to be present at said child's birthday, comes on to his client's partner, and is a disorderly, belligerent drunk.
Does anybody have any more alcohol? Does anyone have more alcohol?
All that in the first 10 minutes of the movie. His negative attributes are just dumped on us, all at once, and it feels as though the director was just going down a list of all the worst human behaviors and attached them to this guy. While it technically does get the job done, Joe is a douchette. We get it. Absolutely no creativity or thought was required to get us to this conclusion. In fact, the movie worked really hard for you in order to get you there. Having your character kick a puppy for the hell of it is a cheap and easy way to connect negative emotions to them, but it's also about as one-dimensional as you can get. And while we needed to learn that Odessu probably wasn't winning any Father of the Year awards himself, he was presented in a way that had a real person quality to him. We all knew that one dude who had one too many and just wouldn't know when to quit a story. And we don't need to follow that guy around all day to assume that he probably doesn't have his life completely in order. So, how does the remake fill that gap? Joe's first sighting of another human happens to be the woman who lured him into the trap in the first place, and we get a scene of him following her until he finally catches up on a football field. She makes it clear she wants to be left alone, and some of the players come to her aid, at which point Joe beats them to a pulp in an overly produced, superhuman-like, and unnecessarily gruesome manner. And he wasn't going to stop either. There just happened to be a small crowd of screaming women begging him not to bash a guy's head in with his own cleat. I understand that all of those years in confinement would make you lose touch, but this truly felt like overkill. It felt so forced. The thing is, there was absolutely no reason for the umbrellaed woman to walk across that field, other than to shoehorn in an excuse for Joe to show off his new skills to the audience. The scene is meant to be a callback to the sparring match between Odessu and some juveniles on a street corner, after a moneyless Odessu can't help himself but grab the first cigarette he sees. It just so happens to be right out of the mouth of one of the smoking boys, risking it all for a long, sweet puff that would make even the biggest non-smoker envious. You can feel how long he's been deprived of any of life's pleasures, and to him, the impulsive move would have totally been worth whatever follows next. The fact that he has an opportunity to test his skills seems like a bonus, and we are treated to a swift but awesome martial arts sequence, with Odessu never even dropping a single ash in the process. These are just some of many scenes that suffer from being watered down, and once you do that enough times, the individual pieces no longer assemble into a respectful whole. And I guess this encompasses the main criticisms I have for the remake. It gets you to the same story beats as the original, yes, but it does so in a much less impressive way, which, in my opinion, is reason enough to argue that the remake should never have been made in the first place. But there's another big issue worth addressing, the treatment of its characters. So let's see how the three main characters are handled on each version respectively. the original, there are a lot of little moments that give you a better idea of their inner workings. Like Mido telling Odesu that the reason he imagined ants is probably because he was lonely. But she wouldn't really know since it never happened to her. Except it's revealed to us that quite the opposite is true. And the movie visualizes just how alone she truly feels by showing her in tears, sitting across a giant ant. Then there's Woo-jin, projecting his own fears onto Odesu, by advising him to consider pursuing revenge as a healthy outlet, but in the same breath warning him that it holds the risk of being a fruitless endeavor that will ultimately leave him hollow inside. Or Odesu himself, who has to come to terms with the fact that he has become a monster and will probably never get to be his old self again. These tiny glimpses let us in on their insecurities and make sense of their actions, but the new version never really gives us any of this. Elizabeth's motivation to help Joe is because she is a charitable person. She's hyper-focused on him for unexplained reasons, and I don't really buy the eventual chemistry that builds between them. Joe isn't motivated by revenge, so there's no dilemma in the acts he's committing. It becomes this taken situation, where he's pretty much justified in everything he does because it's all in the name of freeing his captive daughter. And Adrian. There's just so much wrong with Adrian. He's the most stereotypical, opera-listening comic book villain I've ever seen. And I'll be delving deeper into his comparison to Woo-jin when discussing the twist ending. Another exclusion I thought really hurt the remake were the callbacks to notable literary works whose themes were deeply embedded in the core of the 2013 version. Odesu parallels the tragic character of Greek mythology, Oedipus. Both are unknowingly involved in a parent-child incestuous relationship, having their strings pulled by an untouchable force. Also, both are in a relentless pursuit of knowledge, with the overarching theme being the looming question if they would have been better off not knowing. Because in response to this knowledge, Oedipus gouges his eyes out so he doesn't have to face what he's done. And Odesu cuts off his tongue in order to prove the lengths he's willing to go to protect Mido from the truth, while symbolically severing that piece of him that caused the demise of Woo-jin's sister. Most of these events are presented through the many ironies that also plague the play. It's a detective story, where it turns out the detective is the murderer but doesn't know it. And every time they're presented with supposedly good news, they're led closer to the truth of their own guilt, which is visually expressed through the colors of green and red that are found everywhere around Odesu. Green presenting the little wins along the way, but in reality are breadcrumbs meant to lead him into a devastating red destination. There's a really awesome video breaking down the colors of Oldboy, and I think it's a wonderful companion piece to really drive these parallels home. I'll be sure to include the link below, and I really hope you check it out for yourself. There are also notable parallels to The Count of Monte Cristo, in which the main character, Dante, is falsely imprisoned for 14 years, being taught history, literature, science, and languages by a wise elderly man. Odesu learns from his television set during his 15-year imprisonment, and often recites it once he's on the outside. As in the novel, so in the movie, the driving force is vengeance, as both Dante and Odesu are extremely committed to their quest for revenge on those who imprisoned them. And lastly, I want to talk about Woo-jin's sister, Sua, who has a literary theme of her own, as she's seen reading the unabridged journals of Sylvia Plath, a heavy novel never intended for publication, detailing the private life of its author from age 17 until her suicide, thereby establishing their first connection. Among her works is a poem called Daddy, where the speaker is a girl with an Electra complex, also known as the female version of the Oedipus complex, bringing the parallels full circle. none of this is a thing in the remake, and losing that means losing the nuance that made its predecessors complex characters, which brings me to Woo-jin. Despite having all the means in the world to start a journey of recovery from his trauma, he instead chose to channel that energy into torturing the man he deemed solely responsible for his sister's suffering, all the while suppressing any role he may have played in the incident. This only perpetuated his already unbalanced state of mind, and although by his own admission he was mostly preoccupied with the ongoing persecution of Odessu, we see surprisingly many moments of relentlessly deep sorrow. As delusional as he was, it wasn't what defined him. What truly defined him was his unconventional love he shared with his sister, a love so genuine that he stood by it no matter how taboo it was, leaving Odessu with the cruel challenge to do the same. And that is why all these years of enacting revenge barely scraped up enough happiness to last him as long as an elevator ride in a penthouse. The fleeting sense of satisfaction was gone as soon as he achieved his goal. And although on the surface he appeared to have everything, because he allowed his life to be consumed by this, in the end he was left with nothing. And what's more tragic than that? Adrian's source of damage, on the other hand, comes from the fact that he was a victim of rape and attempted murder. He was a child who grew up with an extremely skewed sense of family, but the movie never chooses to do anything with this, which left me confused as to why the ending was changed so drastically in the first place, because all this exaggerated finale really accomplished was nothing more than to force shock value on its audience for dramatic effect. Woo-jin not only forced Odessu to relive his own experience and feel what he felt as closely as possible, but became a looming presence as he leaves him with an impossible choice: live in your new truth or erase it, only to once again become the detective that will relentlessly seek it out. What a cruel fate it is. And that's why Odessu's expression at the end of the movie is just so powerful. But how was tricking Joe into sleeping with his daughter really revenge for Adrian? It just seems like a randomly concocted plan by a lunatic, leading to a much less ambiguous ending. I think the verdict here is pretty clear. The remake should have absolutely never happened. And that's even without mentioning the famous corridor fight and the downright unbelievably masterful performance as Odessu desperately shifts emotions in an attempt to spare his daughter, leaving me just sitting in awe at its brilliance. And that alone makes it a movie worth revisiting over and over again. The take-home message here is that audiences know the difference between works of passion versus uninspired, greedy cash grabs. And we would like to stop being treated as if we don't.